Mike, we're joined today by our colleague Luke Coffey.
Luke.
It's great to be here.
Welcome.
Thank you.
Luke is a senior fellow at Hudson, where he focuses on transatlantic issues, foreign security policy. He came to us from the Heritage Foundation, where he ran their foreign policy center. A native of Missouri, he is an Army vet and is a great guy all around. Luke, thanks for being here today.
Thanks for having me on.
Missouri is the show me state.
That's right.
What are you going to show us?
I can show you everything as the viewers.
I don't need to see everything. We're on video now.
I guess we have to make sure we get through content restrictions.
Yeah.
We waited for the prettiest face at Hudson Institute to go with the video stream. Luke Coffey, male
superstar.
model. Welcome to Counterbalance.
Thank you for taking our game to a new level.
It's my pleasure. I've only been trying to get on this podcast for about a year now, so it's great to be here with the first edition that's on video.
Yeah, we had somebody cancel, so we had to.
So, Luke, you are known as an expert on many things, but in particular, I'd say NATO and Ukraine are two of your top areas of expertise. Why don't you just start by giving us an overview on where things stand with the war and what we should be looking at?
Well, we're approaching the 2-year mark of the major large-scale invasion of Ukraine by the Russian Federation, but we are approaching the 10-year anniversary of Russia's annexation of Crimea in 2014. And in fact, the week that we were recording this marks the 10th year anniversary of the beginning of the Maidan protesting that eventually led to the ouster of then Ukrainian President Yanukovych and the removal of the pro-Russian regime and the arrival of a more Euro-Atlantic focused Ukrainian leadership. But right now, there's a bit of disappointment about the perceived slowness of Ukraine's counteroffensive that they launched earlier this year, at least on the land side of things. Now, I think from the very beginning, expectations were a bit high. If you remember, about this time last year, Ukraine was ending 2 successful counteroffensive operations, one around Kyiv and the other one around Kherson. And because of these 2 successful operations, people had, I think, inflated expectations for 2023's counteroffensive, and we're seeing it progress very slowly. But on the maritime front, on the Black Sea, we're seeing tremendous success. We've seen now 19 Russian ships of the Black Sea Fleet either damaged or destroyed, including a $300 million improved Kilo-class submarine and the flagship of the Black Sea Fleet. And we're seeing, at least from what we could tell by commercially available satellite imagery, we're seeing Black Sea Fleet ships being moved from Crimea to safer ports inside the Russian Federation. So it's a mixed bag right now. Progress on land has been slow, but there have been other advancements happening in other domains in the war.
How confident are you that the Ukrainian forces can stay in for the long haul, given that it doesn't look like there's going to be any easy victory or any kind of ceasefire anytime soon?
Well, right now, when I speak to Ukrainian officials or I speak to Ukrainian, members of civil society, it's clear that morale is still high, that the determination is still there. Either they're putting on a very brave face and convincing me that they believe this, or they truly do believe this. There's no desire or there's no national movement forming to push for a ceasefire, to push for a negotiated settlement. And I think this is indicative of a nation that's fighting a war of national survival. If the Ukrainians stop fighting tomorrow, their nation ends. If the Russians stop fighting tomorrow, the war ends. And that's the big difference between how each side can influence and drive what is happening on the ground, on the battlefield in Ukraine. But we have to start giving the Ukrainians what they need to win and not just to survive. And the Ukrainians are asking for weapons that are crucial for their success, and we are dithering on providing these, and this has to change.
Why are we dithering?
Well, you'd have to ask...
what's your analysis as to why we're doing
Well,
this?
I believe that the White House is scared of a Russian defeat, that they prefer some sort of managed decline into a frozen conflict, that they feel like they could have more control over, even though I think that's highly unlikely and full of wishful thinking. And we can park this conflict and then focus on implementing a domestic agenda here in the United States. I think that's what the White House is thinking. But the Russians are also nowhere near to wanting a negotiated settlement as well. So I think we're in for the long haul here, and it's in our interest to support Ukraine throughout all of this. And we have to start thinking about this war being measured in years and not months. There were some analysts, including myself, from the very first weeks of the large-scale invasion in 2022, we were writing this in our policy papers. This will be a war that lasts for years. There will be no quick end to this. People have watched too many Hollywood movies. This isn't simple stuff. This is very complex military operations that will likely drag out for years. And we have to think this way instead of thinking, this wishful thinking that there's a silver bullet or this war will end quickly or there could be a negotiated settlement.
As our 45th president of the United States would say, many people are saying, or some people are saying, or maybe let's just name them. Richard Haas and Charlie Kupchan in the pages of Foreign Affairs are saying, we need a ceasefire. Can you game out the dynamics around the United States potentially pushing for a ceasefire? What are the positives, negatives? Is it the right course of action? Do you reject it altogether?
Well, I do reject it altogether because it's completely unrealistic. We're nowhere near a spot where a ceasefire can be achieved because neither side is ready for it or wants it. And only the Ukrainians can decide when they're ready for a ceasefire. America is not a belligerent in this conflict. We're not fighting in it. It's not America's forever war. It's not a proxy war. What happened in February of 2022 was a large-scale Russian invasion of Ukraine. Ukraine is the victim and Russia is the aggressor. And only the Ukrainians can decide when and under what terms they would accept any sort of ceasefire. Now, we should be warned that if Russia all of a sudden announces they're interested in ceasefire talks, it would only be for the sole purpose of reconstituting and refitting their military, which has taken a beating over the past 20 or 21 months. The article in question is full of inconsistencies. On one hand, they say we need a ceasefire so Ukraine can go on take a more defensive posture and consolidate the remaining 80% of the Ukrainian state that's currently under the control of Kyiv. But then on the other hand, they say, and this ceasefire would offer an opportunity for Ukraine to use long-range strike capability to hit Russian targets in Crimea. Well, if you do that, then you don't have a ceasefire. This article is not operating in the world we are in. It's written for a world that we want to perhaps be in, but not in the world with the challenges we're facing.
I want to argue with you about something that you just said. I'm going to misquote you though. You just said only
he's going to build a straw man here.
I'm going to build a straw man at your expense. Yeah,
please do.
No, you said only the Iranians, only the Ukrainians can decide whether to end it. That's not actually factually true, I think, because the United States could. If the United States decided to stop resupplying the Ukrainians and put pressure on its allies to stop resupplying, they could shut down the Ukrainian effort. I'm not saying they should or will, but just as a factual matter, the United States has dials that it can turn that will have a huge impact on the balance of power on the ground. So what I take you to be saying is that is something slightly different. It's that we could do that, but that's not going to affect the Russian calculus. All these people who are saying we need a ceasefire, or it will influence the Russian calculus exactly the opposite way that we think it will. That the people who are proposing this will. That everyone who's proposing a ceasefire and there's something the United States can do to make it happen is assuming that it's American support for Ukraine that is keeping this going. And that if we just and if we just showed a greater desire to settle, then the Russians would settle.
Yeah, well, if the U.S. withdrew support to Ukraine, that would not lead us to a ceasefire. that would lead us in the long term to probably Ukrainian defeat and a Russian victory. So we have to be careful about how we might consider using this lever to influence Ukraine on, pulling or taking back or bringing forward U.S. assistance and U.S. aid to Ukraine. I'm also convinced that if we stop providing Ukraine with weapons and munitions tomorrow, this is a nation that will still fight. They are fighting a war of national survival. Tens of thousands of Ukrainian, children have been abducted and taken away. Their cities leveled by the use of ballistic missiles and Iranian drones. Women raped, civilian infrastructure targeted. They don't have an option but to fight. They see it as a fight for national survival. So I don't think that withdrawing international aid would get us to that, perhaps one could call it the middle ground of a frozen conflict or negotiated settlement. I think it would take us to a Ukrainian defeat.
So just to follow up on that, the only way that you see, I know that you would support Ukraine, or you do support Ukraine retaking Crimea and all of the territory that the Russians have absorbed. But just bear with me here, and as an intellectual exercise, suppose that you wanted to freeze the conflict right where it is. And you wanted an American strategy that could arrive at that. What would that strategy look like?
Well, I wouldn't advocate for a frozen conflict on where the lines are now, because Russia would simply use this time to rebuild and then invade again. We saw what happened. Again, as I said in the opening of this podcast, we're approaching the 10th anniversary of Russia's annexation of Crimea and its intervention in Luhansk and Donetsk in eastern Ukraine. And it's taken them, from that point, 8 years before they decided for the large-scale invasion. So Russia will not be a country acting in good faith in any sort of negotiated settlement. I mean, from 2014 to 2022, there were over 200 rounds of peace talks in various formats, primarily the Normandy format that involved Ukrainian and Russian officials, and there were 20 ceasefires over this 8-year period, and they were all violated by Russia.
So we could get a ceasefire, but it wouldn't be worth the paper it was written on.
Yeah, and if you look at various agreements that Russia has signed in the past, they've reneged on the Astana process in Syria, or the 6-point plan that brought an end to the 2008 invasion of Georgia. Russia is still in violation of 2 of those 6 points today, 15 years later. And there are countless other examples in between these. No, Russia cannot be trusted, at least as long as Vladimir Putin is in power. Russia cannot be trusted in any ceasefire arrangement with Ukraine. And that's why we have to give the Ukrainians all the weapons and tools that they need to be successful, and not just to survive. Because right now, the White House is, they're with the weapons we're providing to Ukraine, at the rate we're providing them, we are heading towards a frozen conflict. And this is not good. This will create a problem down the road for policymakers, where we have this opportunity today to shape the course of events. We have this lack of appreciation for the historical significance of these events that we're facing right now. This is the stuff that our children will read about in history books. It's like when you're an undergrad student or a high school student reading history, and you're thinking about, after reading a page or two, wow, how could so much stuff happen at one time? This is that moment we're living in today. And we have to seize this moment and understand and appreciate the significance of this moment. And we have to act accordingly. We can't have, some of our allegedly top foreign policy elite writing articles about ceasefires that are fantasy. We need someone driving events to shape the outcome in a way that benefits U.S. national interests.
Yeah, I suppose a ceasefire, the additional negative externality is it would probably signal to the world and to Ukraine and Russia that the U.S. was hoping to wind down and freeze the conflict. And without casting aspersions, I suspect that's partly what's motivating some of these calls, is the attempt to get to a managed frozen equilibrium of sorts. You're skeptical, as am I, that one could maintain that equilibrium, but that's where it's heading. But let's relate it to the question of ceasefire. Just one sort of thought experiment. Based on current trajectories, let's say there was a ceasefire in place, stipulated for 6 to 9 months. The Russians are moving towards a war economy. The Ukrainians are beginning to integrate or are in the early stages of integrating Western air power. Who do you think nets out positively over the course of 6 to 9 months in the modernization and updating and strengthening of both sides as we look at the correlation of forces?
Well, I think any ceasefire right now would benefit Russia, because it's only the fact that we have some of these very creative strikes inside of the Russian Federation on key factories, on key infrastructure and transport nodes, that we've had the successful use of unmanned maritime drones, and the very capable use of long-range air-launched cruise missiles like Storm Shadow, that Ukraine has been able to use these, maybe you could describe them as asymmetric means to achieve their intent on disrupting the Russian war machine. If Ukraine had no recourse to these capabilities, or the ability to use these capabilities because of a ceasefire, then Russia would be even better placed to reconstitute and rebuild and get its economy on a war footing. Meanwhile, if in this scenario, as you outlined, Peter, if the West took steps to beef up Ukraine's defense during a proposed ceasefire period, if Ukraine was making advancements to joining Euro-Atlantic structures and institutions like the EU or NATO, these, in my opinion, would likely be triggers. Russia would say, well, then, there is no ceasefire if these things happen. I cannot imagine Russia agreeing to any ceasefire that would allow us to continue arming Ukraine and getting them into these Euro-Atlantic institutions. So this is why I think, for the most part, this idea of a ceasefire is a non-starter. But the main reason why I think it's a non-starter is because neither of the two belligerents in the conflict want it. And as I was saying to Mike, even if we stopped providing assistance to Ukraine, that doesn't mean they're no longer fighting a war of national survival. It just means they're fighting a war of national survival with less equipment and resources.
Staying on the topic of transatlantic defense, and sometimes the best questions are the most basic ones, what is the value of NATO to the United States? Why should we see this as an important part of our security architecture?
Well, the American family.
Do you think that is that a Trumpian question?
No, the Trumpian question would be, some people are saying that NATO's outdated, but...
I think he just suggested it, didn't he? It's implied in his question, I think.
This is like Mike asking whether or not Hamas is a charitable organization or a terrorist outfit. But I have to ask it.
No, look. The American family over more than a century now has devoted a lot of blood and treasure to keeping Europe safe, free, and secure. And now we're able to do this for very little national resources because of NATO, because of that nuclear umbrella that NATO provides the continent, because of that military and security alliance and guarantee that covers the member states of the alliance. We're able to keep what has been traditionally a very bloody and prone to conflict continent and keep it relatively stable and secure. Now, of course, if you're living in Ukraine, you don't find any of this stable and secure. If you're in some places of the Balkans, you also don't find this continent stable and secure. But for the vast majority of the continent, especially those members who are in NATO, it is stable and secure. And this matters to the United States for a number of reasons, but predominantly economic reasons. North America and Europe are together 48% of the global economy, and we're each other's number one export market. We're each other's largest source of foreign direct investment in each other's countries, creating millions of jobs on either side of the Atlantic. And 45 out of 50 states export more to Europe than they do to China.
I hadn't heard that before. That's a good fact.
It's a very important fact to consider. And you know what, Peter, when an American is building a product or providing a service to be exported to Europe, that's an American job. And right now, Vladimir Putin is trying to undermine that stability and security in Europe that has brought the economic prosperity that not only impacts the U.S. economy, but the American worker. And we're able to keep this region secure because of NATO, precisely because of NATO. So NATO has a lot of value in the 21st century. I think some of the problems we have with NATO is we have unrealistic expectations on what we want NATO to do. We have this idea that NATO should be countering China, or NATO should become a counterterrorism force. This was one of President Trump's ideas. But NATO is not designed nor equipped or even has the policy competencies to deal with these challenges. Like take China, for example. China's big threat to Europe is dodgy investments in infrastructure, questionable investments in 5G and this and that. NATO as a security alliance lacks the policy competencies to deal with this stuff. Only the member states, or in some cases the European Union, can confront these challenges. So NATO needs to get back to the basics of its original founding in 1949, and that is, and I'm quoting Article 6 of the 1949 treaty, territorial defense in the North Atlantic region, north of the Tropic of Cancer. Nothing more, nothing less. That should be the main mission of NATO.
It's a little bit like the Federal Reserve. We now expect it to guarantee full employment in addition to fighting inflation and mask some of the ills of our fiscal
policy. And then we get
policy.
Disappointed when it can't deliver things it was never intended to do.
Let me take you back to your depiction of the White House policy. You said they want to manage the conflict. They don't, and they're afraid of Russian defeat. Imagine, again, this is a hypothetical, or and I know you don't necessarily understand what's happening in the meetings at the highest level, but what do you imagine if we had President Biden, National Security Advisor Sullivan, Secretary of Defense Austin, Secretary of State Blinken, all sitting in a room together, and they have a Luke Coffey proposal on the table in front of them to provide the following capabilities so that Ukraine can win.
By the way, they're the guys who canceled. That's why we're having you on the show today.
Yeah.
Yes.
Well, they didn't all cancel. Yeah. Jake Sullivan was coming, but we said no. We'll have Luke Coffey instead.
That's great.
What do you imagine among themselves they say? Why are they rejecting?
Well, they would view what I would propose as being overly escalatory. That could perhaps bring on a bigger conflict. What's
the bigger conflict that they imagine?
That Russia would have no alternative but to respond disproportionately, perhaps through a use of a tactical nuclear weapon, or escalate by other means, which frankly at this point I'm not sure how much more they could escalate short of the nuclear threshold. Even the use of a tactical nuclear weapon in Ukraine, you can look at some of these places, Mariupol, Bakhmut, these places, they might as well have used a nuclear weapon. I mean, that's complete and utter destruction throughout much of eastern Ukraine. But we need to focus on, and this isn't an original
but before you say that, let me just follow this. So do you agree that is a possibility, that Putin might escalate to a tactical nuclear weapon?
You could never rule anything out, of course, especially after Russia's large-scale invasion in February of 2022. Nothing can be ruled out. But I'm not so sure what the use of a nuclear weapon would get Russia at this point. I don't think it would break the will of the Ukrainians to fight, because they look at the great devastation that's already occurred using conventional weapons throughout their country. So I don't think it would prevent them from fighting. I think it would
galvanize us.
It would galvanize. It would unite the most of the international community, and it would also fracture and divide the loose alignment or coalition between, Russia and China and India, and I don't think they would. I don't think especially the Indians and the Chinese would be very happy if Russia used a nuclear weapon. Even I think that would maybe be a problem for especially even for Beijing. And then finally, from a practical point of view, I'm not sure the Russians are trained and equipped to operate in a a radioactive environment. I mean, when you use a tactical nuclear weapon, it creates certain conditions on a battlefield.
A lot of radiation is going to go back to Russia.
You have to have very specialized equipment and a lot of specialized training to operate in this contaminated environment. I remember as a young Army officer just going to the rifle range wearing my full chemical warfare gear, trying to shoot my rifle without being shot at a target. It was very difficult to do. Now imagine doing that in real life on a battlefield while you're being shot at. I don't know if the conventional military of the Russian Federation has the ability or the training to take advantage of any use of a tactical nuke on the battlefield. And finally, there are people who know far more about this than I do, but when I speak to people who know about the Russian nuclear doctrine, there is a place for especially tactical nukes during a conventional warfare. But this is normally, it's my understanding, done at a point when Russia perceives it to be winning.
Yeah.
So it's the idea that it pushes,
you escalate to de-escalate.
So it pushes your adversary over the line to the negotiating table in one big final push. And Russia's certainly not at this point in the conflict. Maybe in the early days of the large-scale invasion, but certainly not right now.
Luke, as you can tell, Mike and I are very serious people with very big thoughts, but every once in a while we like to ask a light question to keep our listeners engaged.
I'm looking forward to this one.
And the first time I read your bio, I noticed that you had traveled to, I think, 6 continents. Do I have that right?
No, I lived on 4.
Lived on 4.
Yeah.
Traveled to 8.
Pardon me? What'd you say?
He traveled to 8.
You traveled to 8. That's impressive. Yeah. What was your? What's the most interesting place you've been and why?
Wow. Well, you're right. I certainly wasn't expecting.
I wasn't either. Why are we? Is this a new? Is this a new?
Actually, you know what? What prompted this?
What?
Didn't you do an interview with C-SPAN where there would be about your book, Ike's Gamble? They asked a series of questions, and then they had an intermission where they'd be like, "Where'd you meet your wife?
Yeah.
Where did you?" I sort of like that. I thought I'd started here today for some reason.
Okay. All right, there it is.
Well, so the most fascinating place that I visited or lived?
Either.
Well, probably one of the most fascinating and interesting places I visited is Svalbard. It's a group of islands about 500 or so miles north of Norway, owned by Norway, but it has, there's a Russian settlement that's allowed to be there by the 1920 Treaty of Svalbard. One of these treaties after World War I, which, kind of divided things up amongst various powers. Norway got these islands, but anyone who signed this treaty at the time could have equal access to work and live and exploit natural resources there. And of course, Russia has a settlement there. And I visited that settlement a number of years ago. And it's a fascinating place. You arrive, it's grimy, it's dirty. There's a big statue of Lenin greeting you as you pull into the harbor, and your cell phone immediately switches over to a Russian carrier. That was probably the most interesting off the beaten path place. But, as
more interesting than Nakhchivan?
Well, and Nakhchivan, actually, that's a very good one. Nakhchivan is a fascinating region too, not visited by many Americans. In fact, that's one of the few places, I would say there are 2 places in the world where in the 21st century you can go as an American and they're surprised to see you. One is Nakhchivan, the Nakhchivan Autonomous Republic, which is part of Azerbaijan, and the other one is Turkmenistan.
You've been to Turkmenistan?
Yes, I have. Yeah,
I want to go to Turkmenistan.
They're genuinely surprised.
How did you get to Turkmenistan?
Well, they allow a certain number of tourist visas a year, and this was back in 2010 or 2011. My wife said, I pick the vacation destination every year. This year you can pick, Luke. And we ended up in Turkmenistan.
And she's never,
we're still together,
and she's never let you forget it.
I told you you'd like this segment, Mike.
Oh, yeah, I love it. Travel with Luke.
All right, so back to the theme of escalation. You mentioned the White House fear of a escalation of tactical nuclear weapon. What about horizontal escalation into NATO? Do you think there's any prospect of that, or is that also overblown?
Well, right now, Russia's conventional armed forces are really tied up in Ukraine. A lot of the focus of the Kremlin is on what's happening in Ukraine. So I don't see a scenario, at least in the short term, where Russia militarily threatens a NATO member. And frankly, we have Ukraine to thank for this. I mean, they are really fighting on the front lines for us, even though they're not in NATO yet, and they're helping keep NATO safer. But, there are certain ways that, Russia can divide the alliance and create problems internally inside the alliance so that we should be aware of. That would perhaps fall under the threshold of an Article 5, which is, an attack on one is an attack on all, but still cause many headaches and problems for us. I mean, one scenario I often throw out, and my Lithuanian friends will hate me for saying this, but there's a rail link connecting the Russian Federation to Kaliningrad, which is Russia's enclave that borders Poland and Lithuania. And imagine a scenario where one of these Russian trains, which aren't allowed to stop when they transit, let's say it breaks down. And it breaks down and, it has sensitive items on it. So the Russians say they have to, kind of form a little security perimeter. But yet they can't fix the train and get it operating. So they demand that another Russian train comes with more workers and spare parts and then, more security. So you have this Russian train that's stuck inside Lithuania with perhaps unmarked, security officials kind of guarding it.
Suddenly you have little green men.
Yeah, suddenly you have a problem that, is this a NATO issue? Is this an EU issue? Is this a national issue? How do we address this? It's not really an invasion, but it causes a problem. But NATO looks weak because everyone expects NATO to solve all the problems. And then you have then you start to have a problem in the transatlantic community. And this is just one example. There are many different scenarios where it doesn't take a huge leap of faith to see how it could play out and become, very dangerous very quickly.
I still want to go back, not to the personal issues, but to the issue of the White. I'm very interested in this issue of the White House and its managerial outlook. And the reason I am is because I believe that they have the same attitude toward Iran. Their gut instinct with regard to Russia and Iran is de-escalate, de-escalate, de-escalate. And the Russians and the Iranians have absorbed those, they have absorbed that, they've clocked that that reflexive attitude in the White House, and they're pocketing a lot from it. And we now have the Russians and the Iranians have technical in addition to their military alliance in Syria, their military alliance in Ukraine, there's an exchange of technical expertise on missiles and drones, which is going to increase the Iranian capabilities significantly. At what point do you think the White House begins to move away from this managerial attitude and sees that it actually is going to have to? It's going to have to provide Ukraine take more offensive countermeasures against these actors, or is there, or maybe the threshold just doesn't even exist?
I don't think it exists with this White House, to be honest with you. We see all of you just highlighted very well, Mike, how these geopolitical challenges are all interconnected. You mentioned the cooperation and in some cases alliance between Russia and Iran, whether that's in Syria or with Ukraine, with all the drones and munitions that Iran is providing Russia for use in Ukraine against civilians in Ukraine. But we also have the North Koreans that provided, according to intelligence estimates from South Korea, the North Koreans have provided 1 million rounds of artillery and possibly even ballistic missiles. You had just a matter of a few weeks after Hamas's deadly terrorist attack on October 7th, Moscow hosting a delegation from Hamas there in Moscow. So these issues are all interconnected, whether we like it or not. And also China as well. We forget in this context, China's playing a role in all of this. It's no coincidence that the same week that President Xi visited Moscow last spring, Prime Minister Kishida of Japan was in Kyiv. And Prime Minister Kishida said that the security of Eastern Europe and East Asia are interconnected. So all these things are connected, but we fail to see them this way. When Russia goes to its Ukraine poker table, it brings its chips from its Syria table. it's Hamas poker table, it's Arctic table, it's China table. When we go to the Ukraine poker table, we just bring our Ukraine chips. We might bring a few NATO chips, but that's
I think
about
that's
it.
deeply ingrained in the American psyche, and I don't understand why.
Yeah, it's just a failure to see.
I know you and I don't see the world this way, and I naturally don't see the world this way. So when I talk to Americans who do, to me they're like from another planet. But there are more of them than there are of me. So clearly I'm the alien.
And when you hear about proportional responses, all that's telling your opponents who have less aggregate power than the U.S. that everything above their level of action is off the table from us.
Right.
So you're essentially handcuffing yourself to like Iranian capabilities or level of power.
Right.
And then it becomes a contest of, will and endurance, which the Iranians think they can win or the Russians think they can win.
Explain, my fellow Americans, to me, fellow Americans. Why are we like this? I don't get it.
I'm not sure we are like that, but our political leadership in the White House seems to have adopted that. I do think there's a bloodless, technocratic, managerial quality to our elite institutions, which churn out elites, especially for the Democratic Party. And so these are the people that tend to populate senior positions and tend to run our policy. But when you put it to your average American, I'm not sure they're totally synced up to what the administration's up to. I mean, just to give you an example, my mother, who knows nothing about foreign policy, nothing, she was like, Carter was a failed foreign policy president. I'm like, why do you say that, Mom? She's like, he lost Iran. When you lose a country, that's a bad thing. You lost a pillar in the Middle East. So all of the kind of the detail about the cleverness, the artful diplomatic off-ramps, the various plays you can run, all of that, in the end for the average American, I think comes down to simple tests. Are we winning or losing? Are we adding allies or subtracting? Are we becoming more or less prosperous? And when you put it simply like that, when you actually have a scorecard where winning matters, then I think this administration probably underperforms. And all the talk about de-escalation, depressurizing, that's a fancy one too.
Oh, depressurizing. That's the new one they've added to that.
That's the one Jake Sullivan used, I think, in his foreign affairs.
I was trying
piece,
to think of it the other day, depressurize, yeah.
And that's right, de-escalate, depressurize.
Engage in dialogue and diplomacy. Yeah.
Dialogue, diplomacy.
Do you like the D words?
It's poetry.
Yeah.
This is a poetry reading now?
Yeah.
So all of that, I think, all of that, I think, appeals to the editors of The Atlantic, but I think less to the average American. At least that's still my assumption. Although, I don't think I understood the level of cancer in our society around the anti-Semitism issue and what we've seen. I mean, my local high school had a walkout the other day. It was splattered across the Alexandria Gazette, from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free. Just a local high school in Alexandria, and the principal said this is going to be great. It'll be peaceful.
I thought you were going to say from Iowa. That would really shock. I was ready to be really shocked.
But originally we said, it's just San Francisco. Then it turned into Dallas. Now we're in places like Alexandria. So I think this is a real. So I could be wrong. Maybe the country is so far gone in a certain way, but I tend to think that's still not right.
Yeah, and also going back to what Peter was saying about the our institutions and the elites that are created from these institutions and our government institutions are feel very comfortable with status quo, so they don't feel compelled or any desire to shape events. Let's just kind of keep things where they are, and we'll manage them incrementally, bit by bit. A good example of this is when the Soviet Union ceased to exist as a legal entity. When it collapsed, the State Department in its Hall of Gallery of Flags, or Hall of Flags, or what, when you walk into the State Department, you see Hall of Flags. They were flying the USSR flag for 5 days longer than the Kremlin was flying it, or the then Soviet embassy in Washington was flying it. When Ukraine in December of 91, early December 91, when Ukraine held a referendum on whether or not to become independent or part of the new Russian Federation, which they overwhelmingly voted for independence, including Crimea. Russia was the second country in the world after Canada to call and congratulate the Ukrainian leadership for the successful referendum and acknowledge the outcome of this referendum. The United States did not recognize Ukraine's independence for another about 23, 24 days after this happened. So for whatever reason, we're slow to react. I don't know if it's bureaucratic inertia or lack of vision or just having wrong people in the wrong places at the wrong time. But for whatever reason, we fail to see the momentous and historical events taking place and treat them as such. We just treat them as routine day to day.
I also say, just connecting the public sentiment with our elite decision making, there's a new NBC poll that came out on Sunday that shows pretty dramatic numbers, especially amongst young Americans, that are either indifferent or outright supportive of the Palestinians or Hamas in particular in this polling. So we'll see over the next year, since we're less than a year out from the election and politics will intrude more and more on our national discourse and policymaking. Is the Biden administration going to stand up for this or stand up against it, or is it going to chase the youth vote, which it will need in dramatic numbers in order to beat if it's President Trump as the nominee or whoever the Republicans put up? Because we've heard a lot about lack of character on the Republican side, lack of character with President Trump. This will be a real moment. We'll see if the Biden administration is going to be strong in support of the Israelis, or whether or not it's going to chase those voters right down the tubes of whatever it is that they're selling.
All right, have we reached a natural breaking point here?
We have. We've counterbalanced today, Mike. Luke, counterbalanced.
Is there anything about your private life that you want to tell us that we haven't covered?
Follow me on Twitter.
Yeah, and your Twitter handle is @Duranimated. Am I right?
Yes. Yeah. At Luke D Coffey, and that's EY, not EE. So
Luke Coffey. It's a pretty good name, Luke Coffey. It could be a detective. Yeah. Detective Luke Coffey.
Yeah.
Okay.
All right. Well, thanks, Luke, for joining us on Counterbalance.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me on.
Thank you.